That was China's share of global solar panel production in 2010. Not small, but still competitive. Europe still had manufacturers. The United States still had technical leadership. Japan still mattered. There were arguments back then, real arguments, about who would dominate clean energy manufacturing. Today, China controls more than 80% of the world's solar supply chain across polysilicon, wafers, cells, and finished modules. In some segments, the number is above 95%. And the strange part is, this didn't happen during some secret technological breakthrough or sudden geopolitical shock. It happened during a period when Washington spent nearly 15 years publicly talking about climate leadership. That's the contradiction sitting underneath the entire energy transition. America debated emissions targets. China built furnaces. The International Energy Agency warned in 2022 that the world's solar supply chain had become dangerously concentrated inside one country. The wording was unusually blunt for the IEA, which normally writes like a committee trying not to upset finance ministers. But by then, the architecture was already set. Xinjiang produced enormous shares of global polysilicon. Chinese firms like Longyi, Trina Solar, Jinko Solar, and Tongwei had scaled to levels Western competitors couldn't financially survive against. Entire industrial ecosystems, glass, silver paste, EVA film, inverters, shipping logistics, clustered together inside China with a density nobody else could replicate quickly. People talk about solar panels as if they're simple consumer products. They aren't. A modern photovoltaic supply chain is closer to semiconductor manufacturing than appliance assembly. You need ultra-pure polysilicon refinement, wafer slicing measured in microns, specialized industrial heat systems, chemical processing, grid integration software, port infrastructure, and financing cheap enough to survive razor-thin margins for years. That last part matters more than most people realize, because China wasn't maximizing quarterly profits. It was building industrial gravity. There's a document from China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology from the early 2010s that barely got attention outside trade circles. It outlined solar as a strategic emerging industry, tied not just to emissions goals, but export leverage, energy security, and manufacturing employment. Western governments mostly interpreted solar as an environmental policy issue. Beijing treated it as a state capacity issue. Completely different lens, completely different outcome. And while this was happening, the United States kept changing direction every election cycle. The Waxman-Markey climate bill died in 2010. Federal tax credits expanded, expired, returned, got renegotiated. Tariffs arrived under Trump. Subsidies expanded again under Biden through the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. Companies planning billion-dollar factories were expected to make 20-year investment decisions, while American policy moved in 4-year increments. Manufacturing hates uncertainty. Finance hates it even more. Meanwhile, Chinese provincial governments were offering land, electricity discounts, state bank financing, tax treatment, and guaranteed industrial coordination to solar firms scaling at impossible speed. Not because every project made sense immediately, many didn't, but because Beijing understood something Washington still struggles to say out loud. Whoever controls the energy manufacturing base controls political leverage later. And this is where the story stops being about climate activists or carbon targets and starts becoming about power. Literal power, grid power, industrial power, diplomatic power. Because solar isn't just another product category anymore, it's becoming foundational infrastructure for the 21st century economy. AI data centers need electricity. EV adoption raises grid demand. Developing countries need cheap generation fast. Europe wants insulation from Russian gas shocks after 2022. India wants energy growth without importing endless coal. Africa's urban population is exploding. Everyone suddenly needs enormous quantities of cheap electrons. China positioned itself at the center of that future before most governments even agreed the future had arrived. And there's another detail buried underneath all this that almost nobody discussed seriously until recently. Once manufacturing ecosystems leave, They don't return easily. Not because Americans forgot how to engineer solar panels, because supply chains behave like ecosystems in nature. Once enough layers cluster together in one geography, the system becomes self-reinforcing. A wafer producer wants to be near chemical suppliers. Chemical suppliers want to be near ports. Equipment makers want to be near engineers. Skilled workers move where factories already exist. Capital follows density. Then one day you wake up and realize the entire ladder is gone. The irony is almost painful. America spent years arguing about whether climate change was real, while China industrialized the response. One side treated solar as ideology, the other treated it as manufacturing. That sounds obvious, it isn't. When prices collapsed through the 2010s, policymakers in Europe and the United States largely interpreted it as a consumer victory. Panels got cheaper, installation accelerated, climate targets looked more achievable. Everybody congratulated themselves for making renewable energy market competitive. But manufacturing economics and consumer economics are not the same thing. A country can win on cheap deployment while losing the industrial layer underneath it. Between 2008 and 2013, more than 24 American and European solar manufacturers either collapsed, downsized, or were absorbed. Germany, which had pioneered large-scale solar adoption through its Energiewende policies, watched companies like Qcells implode under price pressure from Chinese competition. In the United States, Solyndra became the political symbol everyone remembers, partly because the bankruptcy was spectacular, and partly because American politics enjoys turning one failed company into a morality play. The broader reality was uglier and less theatrical. Chinese firms were scaling so aggressively that many competitors simply couldn't survive the margin compression. State-backed credit from institutions like the China Development Bank gave manufacturers room to endure losses that private Western firms could not explain to shareholders quarter after quarter. By 2012, Beijing had reportedly extended tens of billions of dollars in low-cost financing into the sector. Not because every company was healthy, many absolutely were not. But China wasn't protecting individual firms, it was protecting industrial capacity. There's a difference. And you can actually see the mentality gap in how both countries talked about solar during that period. In Washington, the debate sounded like this: how do we incentivize clean energy adoption? In Beijing, it sounded closer to, how do we dominate the manufacturing stack before demand explodes globally? One conversation was downstream from consumption. The other started upstream with production. That distinction shaped almost every outcome afterward. Take polysilicon. Most people have never heard the word, despite the fact it sits near the beginning of the modern energy economy. Polysilicon is the purified material used to create solar wafers, and producing it at scale is brutally energy-intensive. Massive furnaces, constant power supply, specialized chemical engineering, thin margins, not glamorous work, which is precisely why China became good at it. Xinjiang's coal-heavy electricity grid gave producers access to enormous amounts of cheap energy. Western countries criticized the emissions intensity, fairly in many cases, but the industrial logic was still obvious. If your strategy is to dominate solar manufacturing globally, controlling the upstream purification process matters more than looking aesthetically consistent in climate conferences. Again, uncomfortable, but strategically coherent. By the late 2010s, China controlled such a large percentage of polysilicon processing that downstream manufacturers elsewhere became structurally dependent. American or European solar firms could assemble modules domestically, sure, but many still relied on Chinese wafers, cells, or refined inputs somewhere in the chain. The dependency moved beneath public visibility. That's how industrial leverage usually works, quietly at first. There's a company most viewers probably haven't heard of called Xinjiang GCL New Energy Material. At one point, it became one of the world's largest polysilicon producers. Not famous, not culturally visible, but firms like that quietly became more geopolitically consequential than many defense contractors because they occupied choke points inside a future-facing industry. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable for both American political parties. Republicans often framed climate policy as economically destructive, while underestimating how energy manufacturing itself could become a strategic industry. Democrats pushed aggressively for deployment targets, but for years often treated supply chains as secondary details that markets would naturally optimize. Both sides missed the same thing from different directions. Cheap imports can hollow out strategic industries long before consumers notice. The Inflation Reduction Act in 2022 was effectively Washington admitting this, though not explicitly. Buried underneath the emissions language was something much bigger: an industrial policy document, tax credits for domestic manufacturing, incentives for battery production, support for critical minerals processing, local content requirements, federal financing support. The United States suddenly started speaking a language China had been speaking for over a decade. A little late. And even then, rebuilding capacity isn't as simple as announcing subsidies. You need trained labor, permitting reform, transmission infrastructure, machine tool supply, chemical engineering talent, grid modernization, financing ecosystems, and long-term policy certainty. One solar factory is not a manufacturing base. It's a node. The ecosystem around it matters more. There's a reason Apple still depends heavily on Chinese manufacturing despite years of diversification attempts. Once industrial density forms, escaping it becomes slow, expensive, and politically painful. Energy systems behave the same way. This is also where the green energy versus fossil fuels framing starts breaking down. The real competition increasingly looks like industrial systems versus industrial systems. China isn't only building solar panels, it's building ports, HVDC transmission lines, battery supply chains, rare earth processing facilities, EV manufacturing, and grid-scale storage simultaneously. Each layer reinforces the others. Meanwhile, America still struggles to build transmission lines across its own states without decade-long permitting fights. That sentence sounds sarcastic. It's not. Transmission delays are becoming one of the largest bottlenecks in the Western energy transition. You can manufacture all the solar panels you want. If the grid cannot move electricity efficiently, deployment slows anyway. China understood this early and built ultra-high voltage transmission infrastructure at astonishing scale through state grid corporation projects during the 2010s. Industrial strategy is boring until suddenly it isn't. And there's another misconception here that deserves dismantling. People assume China's solar dominance automatically means higher profits for Chinese companies. Not always. Many firms endured brutal competition internally, price wars, overcapacity, debt stress, thin margins bordering on absurd. At times, the industry looked almost self-destructive, but from Beijing's perspective, oversupply wasn't necessarily failure, it was pressure. Flood global markets with cheap panels long enough, and foreign competitors either consolidate, relocate, or disappear. The Pentagon writes reports, European ministers complain about dependency, installers keep buying Chinese panels because they're cheaper. Consumers like lower prices. Politicians like faster renewable deployment. And slowly, the manufacturing center of gravity shifts eastward anyway. There's a dry kind of irony in that. The country accused for years of not caring enough about climate change became indispensable to the technologies meant to solve it. And we still haven't reached the hardest part of this story yet. The hardest part is that China may have won the wrong race, or maybe the race changed halfway through and nobody noticed. Because for all the attention on solar panels themselves, the real constraint in the next phase of the energy transition might not be generation at all. It might be grids, storage, and electricity stability. And this is where the narrative starts getting messier than the clean, China dominates, America failed storyline people prefer. Germany is the warning sign here. Not because renewables failed there, they didn't. Germany massively expanded wind and solar generation over 2 decades. But after shutting down nuclear plants and becoming dependent on Russian gas balancing capacity, Berlin discovered something uncomfortable in 2022. Generating electricity and securing electricity are not identical goals. When Russian pipeline flows collapsed after the invasion of Ukraine, Europe suddenly faced industrial electricity prices that looked almost surreal compared to American levels. Chemical plants slowed production. Fertilizer capacity shut down. Manufacturers relocated some operations abroad. BASF, one of Germany's industrial pillars, openly discussed shifting investment toward China and the United States because energy costs inside Europe had become difficult to justify. That should have triggered panic across Western capitals. Mostly it triggered panel discussions. And this is where the reversal lands. China's solar dominance matters less because of climate politics than because electricity itself is becoming the foundation of geopolitical power. The country that scales stable, cheap energy fastest gains advantages everywhere else. AI infrastructure, industrial automation, military logistics, semiconductor fabrication, desalination, electrified transport. All of it sits downstream from power generation and grid management. Remember that number from the opening? Above 80% control across major solar supply chain segments? Investors looked at those figures and saw market concentration. Beijing looked at them and saw leverage over the operating system of future industry. Different interpretation again. But there's another layer almost nobody discusses carefully enough. China's own energy system remains deeply contradictory. Despite dominating renewables manufacturing, the country also approved enormous amounts of new coal power capacity after 2021. Western critics point to this constantly, usually with a tone suggesting hypocrisy. I understand the argument. I'm not convinced it's hypocrisy. I think it's redundancy. Chinese planners appear less ideologically committed to specific energy sources than Western debates often assume. Their priority seems brutally practical. Never allow energy shortages to constrain industrial growth. If solar surges, good. If coal stabilizes the grid during demand spikes, also good. If hydro weakens because of drought conditions, build more transmission redundancy. The strategy feels less like environmental idealism and more like civilizational risk management. That may sound cold. States tend to be. Meanwhile, the United States still talks about energy in fragmented political categories: oil versus renewables, climate versus jobs, environmentalism versus industry, while competitors increasingly treat electricity as integrated national infrastructure. There's a reason China installed more solar capacity in 2023 alone than the United States had cumulatively installed in its entire history up to that point. And yes, that statistic sounds almost fake the first time you hear it. It wasn't symbolic deployment either. Utility-scale expansion accelerated across provinces because local governments were under pressure to support growth as the property sector weakened. Which creates another strange twist in this story. Solar became partially tied to China's economic stabilization strategy. Factories slowing? Build grid infrastructure. Local governments stressed? Push industrial investment. Export demand weakening? Flood external markets with cheaper clean tech products. The same industrial machine adapted to multiple problems simultaneously. Western governments tend to separate policy into departments. China often stacks objectives on top of each other. Not always efficiently, but consistently. And before this turns into some simplistic China plans, America declines narrative, there's an important counterweight. Chinese dominance carries vulnerabilities too. Heavy export dependence creates political backlash abroad. The European Union launched anti-subsidy investigations into Chinese EVs and solar sectors. The United States tightened restrictions tied to forced labor concerns in Xinjiang through the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. India aggressively pushed domestic manufacturing incentives to avoid becoming permanently dependent. Countries eventually resist concentration once dependence becomes visible enough. The question is timing. Because rebuilding industrial ecosystems takes much longer than realizing you need them. An engineer can't be manufactured overnight. Neither can precision industrial tooling, or specialized glass production, or high-voltage transformer capacity. America learned this during the semiconductor shortages after COVID. Europe learned it after Russian gas disruptions. The supply chain only becomes visible when it breaks. That's the pattern connecting all these stories. We spent 30 years treating efficiency as resilience. They are not the same thing. Sometimes the cheapest system is also the most fragile one. And honestly, I think this is where the conversation becomes less comfortable for free market absolutists and for climate idealists at the same time. Markets are extremely good at reducing costs. They are not naturally designed to preserve strategic redundancy. Democracies are very good at public debate. They are often terrible at sustaining industrial continuity across election cycles. China exploited both realities, quietly at first, then all at once. There's one more piece to this puzzle, though, because if solar panels become abundant enough, truly abundant, then the bottleneck shifts somewhere else entirely, not to energy generation, to the materials, grids, storage systems, and political institutions needed to handle a civilization built around almost limitless electricity. And I'm not sure Western governments have fully absorbed what that transition actually demands. The strange thing about monopolies is that they rarely look dangerous while they're forming. At first, they look efficient. Consumers get cheaper products. Politicians celebrate falling costs. Analysts write optimistic reports about globalization. Quarterly inflation numbers improve. Everybody feels clever right up until the moment dependence becomes visible. And by then, the leverage already exists. That's where we are with solar. Not at the beginning, not even in the middle, past the lock-in point. And I think the real lesson here has very little to do with whether you personally like China, distrust China, support renewables, or miss the old fossil fuel order. Those arguments are emotionally satisfying, but they sit downstream from the harder reality. Industrial civilization runs on physical capacity. Factories, ports, grids, machine tools, metallurgy, chemical processing, transmission lines, skilled labor, long-term financing. The boring layers underneath modern life. For years, much of the Western world convinced itself these things were interchangeable commodities that could simply be purchased wherever they were cheapest. That assumption is aging badly, because strategic industries are different from ordinary consumer markets. If another country dominates sneaker manufacturing, your civilization survives. If another country dominates the infrastructure underpinning your future energy system, your political options narrow over time. Foreign policy changes, trade policy changes, military planning changes. Even domestic electricity prices can become partially exposed to decisions made elsewhere. Dependence leaks upward into everything. And to be fair, the United States has finally started reacting. The Inflation Reduction Act triggered a wave of announced clean energy manufacturing investments across states like Georgia, Arizona, Texas, and Ohio. Companies including First Solar, Hanwha Q-Cells, and Meyer Burger expanded or proposed new facilities. Treasury guidance tied subsidies to domestic sourcing thresholds precisely because Washington now understands supply chains cannot be treated as an afterthought anymore. But there's a difference between starting a race and catching someone already near the finish line. China's advantage isn't just scale, it's accumulated coordination. Suppliers know each other. Ports are optimized around throughput. Engineers circulate through dense industrial clusters. Provincial governments compete to accelerate deployment instead of litigating transmission corridors for 11 years. State banks absorb timelines private investors often reject. Again, not because the Chinese system is magically efficient. It absolutely produces waste, debt, overbuilding, and political distortions. Entire ghost industrial projects exist there too. But when Beijing decides a sector matters strategically, capacity appears with frightening speed. Western governments still seem surprised by this every time it happens. There's also a deeper cultural layer underneath the policy discussion that people avoid because it sounds philosophical until suddenly it becomes material. Large parts of the West gradually stopped treating manufacturing as civilizational prestige. Finance became prestige. Software became prestige. Platforms became prestige. Making physical things became something outsourced, optimized, abstracted away. China went the other direction, not entirely by choice at first. Manufacturing was originally the ladder upward. But over time, Beijing recognized something older industrial powers once understood instinctively. Whoever builds the physical substrate of the next era shapes the rules of that era. That applies to ships, railroads, semiconductors, electricity, and probably AI infrastructure next. The irony is almost too clean. Silicon Valley spent years promising a frictionless digital future, while China accumulated dominance over the literal silicon-enabling parts of the energy transition. Different meanings of the same word, very different consequences. My own view? I think the United States eventually partially rebuilds solar manufacturing, but not enough to fully displace China this decade. The ecosystem gap is too large and the timelines are too short. What probably emerges instead is a fragmented energy world. America trying to friendshore supply chains through Mexico, Vietnam, India, and allied states. Europe attempting selective protectionism while balancing climate targets. China continuing to export overcapacity aggressively to preserve industrial momentum. Less globalization, more bloc formation. And honestly, this may extend far beyond solar panels. Batteries, transformers, grid hardware, critical minerals, industrial robotics. The same logic keeps repeating. Governments are rediscovering that resilience costs money. Strategic redundancy costs even more. For 30 years, many assumed efficiency alone was enough. History tends to punish civilizations that confuse the two for too long. There's one final detail from this story I keep coming back to. During the 2000s and early 2010s, Western politicians often spoke about clean energy as a moral responsibility. Chinese leadership spoke about it as economic positioning. Morality matters. Climate change is real. Emissions matter. But states ultimately move hardest when power, growth, and stability align with the mission. China aligned them earlier. That doesn't mean the future belongs to Beijing automatically. Industrial leadership changes. Technology shifts. Political systems overcorrect. Dominant supply chains create backlash. Empires make mistakes. All true. But the scoreboard right now is difficult to argue with. The country many Americans still reflexively describe as the world's factory quietly became something more consequential. The central manufacturing platform for a major share of the future energy economy. And America noticed halfway through the build-out. That's not fatal, but it's expensive. If you made it this far, you probably care less about slogans and more about how power actually moves underneath headlines. Subscribe if that's your thing. There's a lot more happening beneath the surface than quarterly news cycles usually capture. And somewhere tonight, another provincial government in China is approving another industrial expansion project, while Washington debates whether permitting reform should take 8 years or 10.